In this week's Torah portion, Lech Lecha, behind the familiar beats of get yourself to that promised land and the birth of monotheism and the promise of covenantal relationship between very finite human being and infinite divine, there is a lesser well-known story. Avram, the Hebrew, hears the word of invaders, a mighty army that has come to Canaan. They have arrived, an elite fighting force from what is today somewhere between Iraq and Iran, under the command of the king named Cheder LaOmer. And Cheder LaOmer is a mighty lord. He is in fact so powerful that at some point a decade or two before this story began, he conquered all the way from Iran to Canaan. And there he subjugated the local kings. He forced them to serve him and to send them tribute. And they did this for many, many years until, as is always the way of kings who pay tribute to masters that they don't like very much, they did until they didn't. And 1 year after the local kings rebel, Cheder LaOmer returns with his royal vassals, and his army crosses the Jordan River, and it travels south through at what that time was a lush valley, but today we know only as the area around the Dead Sea, and he proceeds to crush this rebellion, destroying their more numerous armies in battle, looting, destroying their cities and their towns, and of course taking captives. One of those cities that Cheder LaOmer loots and ransacks is the city of Sodom. And one of those captives, as you heard, is Lot, Avram's nephew. And this is, as our bar mitzvah so expertly taught us this morning, the biblical proof text for the mitzvah of Pidyon Shevuim, of the redemption of the captive. For Avram raises the sword and chases after his stolen nephew. It is now, God help us, the second cycle of reading this story since October 7th. Last year, when we reached this moment in our Torah, literally weeks after the attack, the prayers of Jews around the world, and especially in Israel, were turned towards the redemption and the safety of the hostages, and they were rooted in two strongly held beliefs. The first was that yes, the danger would be great and the toll would be heavy, but there was no doubt that the IDF would go into Gaza and they would find our people and they would bring them home, just like Avram did. And there have indeed been cases of this exact echo of the Tanakh. Noah Argamani is the most famous, but there are 7 more souls that have been rescued alive, 6 Israelis and one non-Jewish Bedouin. But the second of those twin beliefs was that if the IDF could not rescue the hostages by force of arm and heroic will, like Avram did, then the nation would stop at nothing to bring them home through negotiation. Because this is the promise that Israel has made to its citizens, it has made to its military, especially those who live along the border for generations. This is the promise that brought politicians and diplomats and intelligence officials and humanitarians from across the world to those summits and mediated negotiations for over a year now between Israel and Hamas. And one of the great blows to the Israeli psyche, part of the ever-growing rift inside of the Israeli populace over this last year, has been the diminishment of the Israeli public's trust in both of those once treasured beliefs. And I would argue that this morning, returning to the Parsha for the second time since October 7th, that actually both beliefs are not just diminished, they are in fact broken. After more than a year of fighting, but perhaps more importantly, after the execution of those 6 hostages, including Hirsch Goldberg Polin in Rafah this summer, things changed. Once it became explicit that Hamas would not hesitate to murder the hostages, not only during the active attempt to rescue them, but at any moment that it was possible they might be saved, the belief that the IDF could physically rescue them, and even the belief that they were still alive, has diminished drastically. And after a year of failed negotiations, after significant civil unrest within half of the Israeli public repeatedly and publicly accusing the prime minister and the government of prioritizing the coalition and political expediency over the lives of the stolen, this week 2 major events signified a final and fatal crack in the belief that the Netanyahu government is working in good faith to bring the hostages home. The first was the firing of Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, on Tuesday. There were other things going on Tuesday. I don't blame you if you missed this. This is unprecedented. It is an unheard of action by a prime minister to, in the middle of a multi-front ongoing war, as Iran takes unprecedented military action, to remove the top minister who has been coordinating the military efforts. It is so unexpected, so unprecedented in Israeli history that most people thought it was simply impossible. No one would do this until at least one front of the war had closed. Gallant was the strongest political voice within the right-wing coalition who was pushing for an investigation into the military intelligence and government failures that made Israel vulnerable leading up to October 7th. He was one of the only right-wing voices to publicly struggle with the judicial coup that the coalition had put forward. He was one of the few right-wing voices pushing back this last week alone on new exemptions and stipends for ultra-Orthodox draft refusers. And he repeatedly went on record prioritizing the rescue of the hostages through the importance of a negotiated release. Bibi's choice to fire Gallant is so nakedly political, so removed from the reality of the war and rooted in his desire to protect the coalition voting bloc, that tens of thousands of Israelis rushed the streets and the highways on Tuesday night to protest. Because without Gallant, there is nobody left within the coalition to push back on the prime minister, on the demands that he is receiving from Kahanists, on the ultra-Orthodox fundamentalists, and he is beholden to them. There is no one left who has the courage to say, Pidyon Shevu'im mitzvah rabbihu. The Pidyon Shevu'im, the redemption of the hostages, this is a major, most important mitzvah. And the second blow of this week was the revelation that Eli Feldstein, a spokesman within the prime minister's office, a former aide to one of those Kahanists, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has been arrested by Israeli intelligence, by the Shin Bet, for illegally leaking sensitive documents to foreign media. And the filing states that he seemingly and explicitly did this in an attempt to swing public opinion and quash any and all hopes for a hostage deal. Feldstein argues the Shin Bet was behind the leaking of sensitive, classified information, some of which was real and some of which was fabricated, which always supported the prime minister's public statements that any public and proposed hostage deal was simply impossible. This includes the debunked rumor that Yahya Sinwar was planning to flee Gaza with the hostage through the Philadelphia corridor into Egypt and then ultimately Iran. That story broke and was debunked in a week after there was a public dispute between the Defense Ministry and the Prime Minister's office on the Philadelphia corridor. And there is a consideration that Feldstein is the one who leaked documents that supported the Netanyahu talking point that Hamas was using the negotiations only as a form of psychological warfare, which essentially absolved the prime minister for refusing any and all options. And in the days since his arrest, the prime minister has distanced himself from Feldstein despite evidence and testimony that repeatedly makes their relationship explicit. It is the kind of truth denial that has become de facto in politics. The opposition points out actually that there is no good outcome here. If you don't believe Netanyahu, if you believe that the prime minister was directing this effort, he has criminally undermined intelligence. If you believe the prime minister that he didn't know and he wasn't doing this, then somehow he has created a government where someone is so high level that they are able to undermine him the entire time without him knowing. Either way, the subtext of the last 6 months has become the text, that the Prime Minister's office explicitly and purposefully is not making any deal to free the hostages. It has made such a deal impossible. In the span of a single reading of our Torah, it is hard to believe how much these two bedrock beliefs, that Israel will do everything in its power to save our hostages and that the IDF has the power to save our hostages, to see both of them completely shattered. So what comes next after such a shocking week in Israeli politics? Well, to answer the East, we have to look south. With Donald Trump returning to power, the future of the war and Israel's ability to fight it is actually quite uncertain. Supporters of the American president-elect from the Jewish community are optimistic. They highlight his past support for Israel, his friendship with Saudi, his hatred for Iran, the success of the Abraham Accords, his deep popularity, which is very important to him amongst Israelis, and his previous defunding of UNRWA, UNRWA, as proof that Bibi will be given a blank check to finish the job. But meanwhile, supporters of the American president-elect from his newly expanded support in the Arab American community, a community that has publicly helped him win the battleground state of Michigan, who he is publicly thanking, they are also very optimistic. They point to his statements on the campaign trail that he wants the war to end because he is a president that stops wars. They believe them when he says it's very easy to simply stop sending bombs if a foreign government doesn't do what you want. They believe that an America First ideology has little interest in funding unpopular wars. And they believe him when he calls PA head Mahmoud Abbas, like he did yesterday, and says he will stop the war. Both groups of Republican voters strongly believe that Trump will support their diametrically opposed visions and desires for the region. And with an American president as unpredictable and deeply motivated by both personal grudges, approvals, and slights as Donald Trump, the whole world holds its breath. What do we do while we hold our breath? We return, of course, to Torah. Parshat Lech Lecha reaches its zenith, and Avram's war comes to an end. He is victorious. Lot is saved. And thousands of years later, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev argues that it is this moment, this victorious moment of Avram's transformation, that is the story more than any other moment in this entire Torah portion, which brings Avram to Avraham. To the Kedushat Levi, Avraham is the exemplar of kindness and compassion. Avram is the symbol that God loves us. Thank you, Rabbi. And he has the ability to bring that merciful compassion down into the world. But this time, in the moment when Lot is stolen away, the Kedushat Levi argues that this gentle, loving, compassionate Avraham has to cloak himself in a different aspect of God. And that aspect is Gevura. That aspect is heroism and strength. And he takes on an aspect, a role, and a responsibility that he never thought he would have to or that would fit him because he has no other option. We stand, Israel stands, Jews everywhere stand at a decisive moment of transformation. What you need to know about this week's Torah portion, according to the Kedushat Levi, is that the covenant is only cut and the covenant only happens because Avram makes that choice. He chooses to be transformed and step out and become someone new. In the coming months and years, the only thing that we know is change. Israel is changing. The United States is changing. The horrific events in Amsterdam just a few nights ago show us that the world is changing, and yes, Canada too. Canada is changing. And so can we also wrap ourselves in heroic courage? Can we wrap ourselves in gevura as the world around us changes? Yes, we can. I know we can. But more importantly than can, I know, in fact, we must. We must each in our own way embody the famed words that give this week's Parsha its name. We must each in our own way, lech lecha. We must go. We must go ourselves to the place where our individual strengths and our merits and our values will make a difference. Make a difference for our Jewish community, even and especially if, like Avram, we do not yet know where we are going or if we are ready. Because we cannot stay anywhere else. With God's help, may our merits in meeting this moment, as it did for Avram, make the world more just, more compassionate, and more sacred. Chazak v'baruch, strength and blessings for us all. Shabbat shalom.